thank you so much for joining me today. Do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, and I have kind of research interests in ecology, conservation, resilience, and how biodiversity around the world is responding to anthropogenic stress. So things like climate change, pollution, overharvesting. And I also do teaching, so I teach students, and part of that is teaching conservation biology and ecology.
Brilliant. That's amazing work. And I imagine that wildlife data recording is quite a big part of that. Do you think you could tell us why that's really important for nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So without tracking what wildlife we have, what biodiversity we have around the world, it's impossible to know whether we're losing it, whether we're gaining it, how it's changing through time. And so long-term records of species, where they've been seen, how many of them there are kind of fundamental and critical to ecology and conservation, right? So both to understanding why species are in certain places and why they're not in certain places, but also how we can then conserve those species if they become threatened by things like climate change.
Exactly, it's super important. And is there anything going on in Bristol at the moment in terms of this kind of research that it's important to talk about?
Yeah, so the University of Bristol and the School of Biological Sciences does quite a lot of research kind of in this area. So one of our goals is to try and come up with solutions to the biodiversity crisis. And so really understanding those patterns of biodiversity and how they're changing is really important to the work we do in the school. So we're doing research on things like how resilience is changing. So whether populations are able to cope with increasing stress through time. There's quite a lot of research done on that. And also looking at things like multiple stressors. So if a population is, say, being affected by both climate change and by overharvesting, is that worse than just being affected by climate change by itself? And how those interactions can drive patterns of biodiversity, and therefore, what's the most important stress to remove then? Is it climate change? We have to start mitigating for that, or do we need to try and remove that overharvesting pressure, because that's going to have the biggest positive effect on the populations that we want to try and conserve?
Involved in the Ecological Emergency Strategy work in Bristol. There's a lot of people that might not know what that is or what it means, and the different projects that are going on to help raise Bristol's biodiversity. Is that something you could tell us a bit about as well?
Yeah, so I'm involved looking at developing a wildlife index for Bristol. And that's effectively a way of tracking how wildlife has changed through time, and then looking to see whether we're having a positive impact on that into the future. So as we said before, it's really fundamental to understand where biodiversity is and how it's currently changing and has previously changed. And from there, we can then come up with strategies to try and slow that change or hopefully reverse it, right? That's the ultimate goal that we want to have. And so we're currently looking at developing a wildlife index, which is basically a way of combining data from lots of different species, from birds, from butterflies, from fish, into a single measure to see how biodiversity is changing in the Bristol area. And that will then give us a kind of baseline measure to work from. So one of the goals of Bristol City Council is to try and increase biodiversity over the next 5 to 10 years. And so once we've developed this index, we can then say, okay, this is the current state of biodiversity. This is what it's done over the last 5 to 10 years. Then are the things that we're doing, like planting trees, improving green spaces, having a positive impact? And so that'll be something that we then take going forward, continue to measure biodiversity, continue to go out and count birds, butterflies, etc., and then see whether these changes that are being implemented are having this hopeful positive effect. And therefore, should we keep doing those things, or do we need to try something else? Do we need to change it up a little bit and implement a different strategy?
Brilliant. And is there anything that just people out in Bristol and Bath and the west of England region, anything that they can do to try and help this work by collecting data?
Certainly, yeah, by collecting data, absolutely. So apps like iNaturalist are a fantastic way to log the species that we see around us. So again, having abundance counts and having tracks of where species have been seen is fundamental and underpins all of this research. And so having people going out, collecting data on species they've seen in their garden, logging that, and then producing those large data sets is really critical. So not only can people do things like improve their gardens for biodiversity by putting out hedgehog homes and improving connectivity between different gardens and planting plants for biodiversity, they can also make a really positive impact by collecting that data so that we know where we are currently and how it's going to change into the future.